Over at Bradley, which was a walk through the fields, I got word that a New Zealand home economics teacher had arrived, and I found time to head over there one afternoon and discovered that she wasn't able to walk very far as a result of an early childhood disease which had affected her legs. She was very welcoming, and when I found out that she loved sewing, I decided to encourage Tendai to have another shot at passing her home economics exam. They became good friends, and Miss Abbott eventually found herself hosting an enthusiastic companion and cultural navigator. Tendai decided she was going to live the life of a European as well as being an African and began to play Scrabble with Miss Abbott as a means of expanding her vocabulary. They helped each other in many ways, and it provided a template for future relations with other expat teachers that she encountered in the coming years. Time was rushing by, and I had decisions to make. I hoped that I might manage an extension to my contract so that I could see my Form 4s through their final exams in November rather than leave in August, and hoped that another qualified teacher would arrive in time to help them. However, there was another matter that was coming to a head. Tendai was expecting. Dear Elijah, I was wondering if I could ask a small favor of you. At the end of April, I shall be in the need of the services of a best man. I was wondering if you'd be interested in the position. RSVP as soon as you can, Mr. Garford. On April 28, 1988, a small group of us gathered at the Bindura Hotel before heading off to the courthouse. It was a party of 6, including Kate and Patrick, the father of her child, Elijah and Lazarus as witnesses, and the two of us. It needed to be a legal wedding as the paperwork was necessary for Tendai's immigration papers. This was not to be confused with a spectacular and very communal traditional wedding, which stood on shakier legal ground when it came to the division of assets in cases of divorce. But they were much more fun and were acknowledged as being the real thing by family and neighbors, all of whom would have feasted well. Tendai's parents knew nothing of the event, as she had chosen not to inform them at that time. There was a brief ceremony, and the registrar performed the necessities, despite the fact that the application made me 3 years older than I actually was, and Tendai a year younger. Afterwards, we enjoyed a nuptial breakfast at the hotel and headed off to Harare for a brief celebration. As my last official term progressed, I had to return to Harare and begin signing different documents, ones that could not only extend my contract beyond August, but I was having to arrange for the two of us to be traveling, not just one. I knew that processing Canadian immigration forms and waiting for a reply could take time. Would I have to leave Tendai behind in Zimbabwe, which was the alternative, and for how long? I looked into the possibility of signing up for another 3 years with WUSC, but the new administrator looked at my files and decided I was too much work. However, it was agreed that finishing out the year would benefit my students, and happily, I managed to extend my contract until December. In August, we went on a honeymoon to Botswana. It was Tendai's first time on a train. It was her first time to visit Botswana. It was the first time I was thrown off a train. They were the first of many firsts for both of us. I had entered a new world, and Tendai would be my guide for much of it. Fortuitously, as things turned out, I had visited Martha's Spey Senior Secondary School in Francistown and asked if there was any chance that I could get a job there in the coming year. Mr. Chakalisa, another Napoleonic short man and determined headmaster of the school, took my particulars and promised he would call me soon. We left things at that and returned home to watch how things would turn out. At the time, I was seriously in love with Zimbabwe. I had found a small farm that I hoped I might purchase with my resettlement dollars, and if I was able to teach in the area, I might have been able to look after some of Tendai's siblings and build a life for us in Zimbabwe. However, someone must have been looking out for us. In retrospect, I would not have survived the oppression and violence in the country that developed as Mugabe chose to direct it as president rather than as prime minister. December saw a farewell party at Matumba. Both David and Lazarus showed up, and Lazarus cried copious amounts of tears. Gladys bought a donkey cart and went home with a bed, a Chesterfield and a set of drawers, and Mr. Chingono gave my brave little battery-powered radio a good home. Most of the teachers had already gone on holiday, and we said our goodbyes at the last staff meeting. We made our way to the Harare International Airport with a degree of uncertainty and promise in the air. In Africa, time slows with every kilometre travelled outside of the city limits. The noise and clutter of the city was massaged from our anxious hearts, and gradually we were lulled back into life at the pace of the seasons, not clocks. The sense of betrayal by the WUSC field officer, the expressions on the faces of the gathered ministry officials, the uncertainty of what the future held for us, plus the fact that we were going to meet Tendai's family after having already married in secret, were issues that weighed heavily on my shoulders. I needed time and space to think things over. I never did manage to remember which turn to take to reach Hwata after leaving the Mzingezi Road. Hwata is set in a maze of bumpy dirt roads, some graded and others were just happenstance. Often it was hard to differentiate between the two because the water flowing swiftly from the nearby escarpment could turn the best of them into rutted tracks during the rainy season. Especially the main track leads to the town of Kariba, some 300 kilometers away to the west. It was pitch dark when we reached the valley floor, and we passed alternating patches of wild jungle and sleepy hamlets carved out of the rich alluvial soils of the alluvial floodplain. It was hard to tell that from the headlights as the bus as it twisted and bounced along in which direction we were heading. When we reached Hwata, we eased ourselves from the bus, unloaded our heavy suitcases, and headed down the road that was lit by a slowly rising moon and myriads of bright stars. It was a walk of well over a kilometre, and we were unsure of the reception we would receive at the end of it. Sakuru's compound was immaculate even at midnight. Everyone was asleep outside on bamboo mats when a somewhat tentative Tendai and a strange white man arrived from afar. "Hello, Daddy. I have been to England last week." "Yes, I really flew in a plane, a very big plane. And by the way, this is my husband, and I am now called Mrs. Raymond Garford. He has no job, but I am hoping he will get one soon. You see, he has to leave Zimbabwe. I'm so happy to see you, Daddy." It didn't happen quite like that, even though it makes a reasonable facsimile. It was January 1989. Tendai and I had married the previous April at the Bindura courthouse. She did not inform any of her relatives that she intended to marry, let alone that he was a white foreigner and several years her senior. Partly it was because of her upbringing. Tendai had joined the freedom fighters when she was just 8 and left Zimbabwe with them. She later told me it was because she saw some French legionnaires at the market who told a group of young boys that there were sweets inside the barrels of their guns. When the boys opened their mouths and put them up to the guns, the soldiers pulled the triggers. She said she saw 3 young boys die, and she had been at school with them. After witnessing such things, perhaps she felt she no longer needed permission to do anything. Before Christmas, we flew to London, still waiting word from my contract, and if it had or had not been extended. As a precaution, I looked for a teaching position in England, and on the same day I was to begin at a primary school near Birchington. I also received a phone call from the Zimbabwe Minister of Education offering me a 1-year extension. Um, I was never a primary school teacher, but it was hard to leave my mother, who was just experiencing the first signs of dementia. However, the plans had already been drawn up to move her closer to my brother so she could be provided with proper care. I had been absent from her life for many years, and perhaps I had lost the right to have any say in her affairs. As it turned, things did not unfold quite the way they were supposed to. I did not enjoy a very positive relationship with Miss Jones, the new Worskfield officer. She was an Ottawa bureaucrat transplanted into the less formal setting of a recently independent African nation. And rather than learning about the way things were done there, she insisted on being a crack, "I'll show those peasants how it's supposed to be" policy pusher. Things seriously deteriorated after Tripoli was bombed on the orders of US President Ronald Reagan. Canadian Prime Minister Mulroney leapt with indecent haste into supporting the action. Canada was in the middle of negotiating NAFTA at the time, and Mulroney wanted to impress the US Senate. Zimbabwe was largely dependent on Libyan oil, so when it was learned that we had been party to the incident, Canadians in Zimbabwe found themselves in a delicate situation. Several of the teachers had signed a letter condemning the action and sent it to the Harare Herald, the national newspaper. Miss Jones gathered all of those who had signed their names to the offending article in Harare and would have shipped them home on the next plane had not the first secretary at the High Commission intervened. I was one of the signatories. Just prior to this, I had also written and submitted a study guide to college press in Harare, and it had been accepted for publication. Suddenly, everything that we intended to print had to have the approval of the WUSC office, which was really inconvenient for me at the time, as time was running out for Tendai and I. When you are teaching 128 kilometers outside of the city and having to rely on buses, as well as needing to be at school because your students are facing life-deciding state exams, dealing with a petty bureaucrat is the last thing you need. An already unsatisfactory relationship took on an infinitely sour tone, and she left it until the last possible moment to give her approval of the project. One of the distinct curses of foreign currency controls, which were necessary in Zimbabwe at the time, is that taking money out of the country is a challenging proposition. I decided to simplify the matter by going to see Senator Joseph Culverwell, the Deputy Minister of Education, who, among other things, handled scholarships. He was a former English teacher himself, so he was delighted to accept and administer the royalties from the book on behalf of Matumba Secondary School. A letter of agreement was drawn up. The publishers arranged for the payment of the royalties to the Ministry of Education, and I got to leave. "But why are you leaving?" Asked Senator Culverwell. "You have produced this wonderful book. You are married to a citizen of Zimbabwe. Are you not happy here?" The truth was that Miss Jones had looked at my record and refused my application for a renewal. Senator Culverwell made a direct approach to the ministry on my behalf while we were in England, and it was he who sent word that they had arranged for a 1-year extension of my contract, and I was to report to Mr. Chirapa upon my return. Delighted and rather unwittingly, I sent a note to Miss Jones asking about the promised posting to a particular school and concluded with, "I don't trust the Chirapa Mafia." Mr. Chirapa, being a distant relative of Mr. Maeda, the former headmaster of Chindanduma, and the personnel uh, director for teachers in the particular region, was not particularly well disposed towards me. I thought Miss Jones could be trusted to see that I was being placed at a suitable setting, especially after the Bindura fiasco. On my return to Zimbabwe, I went directly to the ministry to deal with the necessary paperwork and to confirm this posting to Marandera. I was ushered into the Mashonaland district office and confronted by Mr. Chirapa, along with the secretary for the region and the senior inspector for English for the region. Miss Jones had copied my letter and sent it to them. Mafia? You say mafia? They are criminals who deal with drugs, who organize prostitutes, who murder people, yes? And which is it that Mr. Charapa is supposed to do? Well, tell me. I was unable to defend myself other than to say that Miss Jones should not have shown them the letter and that it had been sent to her in confidence. It was a deliberate action on her part, and she was successful in getting rid of me. She was in Zimbabwe to wrap up the program, and 3 years later, there were no more Canadian teachers left in the country. Needless to say, I was stranded in Harare with my new wife and no immediate prospects of employment. It was a very scary position to find myself in. With dwindling resources, no job prospects, and the possibility of bride price becoming an issue, Tendai and I headed to Huata on the last bus of the day. It was with trepidation, therefore, that I entered this peasant farmer's home in the dark, a very long way from Vancouver.